In this lesson, we're doing the gasoline explosion. Now, as I showed you guys in the introduction to this course, you can get a pretty nice explosion going using the presets down here. So as before, you would just create an object and then you can click on this setup and a gasoline explosion preset here and it'll get you something that looks pretty good. However, I want you to understand how to set it up from scratch and how the settings influence the explosion. So first, make sure that you're working in meters and 1 unit is 1 meter. And we're gonna start by creating a sphere in the middle of our scene and make sure that it's sitting on the ground about something like this. Then as always, let's create a Phoenix grid and let's create a source right away. And let's add the sphere as our source. Now, we're not gonna emit temperature or smoke, but we're only gonna emit fuel, and the fuel is then going to create all of the smoke. Now, what we need to do to get an explosion, when you think about it, is to have a burst of energy. So we need to animate the outgoing velocity to go from a really high value to 0. So on frame 0, I'm gonna enable auto key and set this to maybe 500 meters to start. And then I'm gonna go to frame 1 and set this to 0. So again, for 1 frame, I'm gonna be emitting the fuel at a 500 meter outgoing velocity, which is gonna give us the initial explosion. And then you need to give it a bunch of noise to break the explosion up. So as you can see here, I'm getting a various amount of plumes going in all directions. I have this one, this one, this one. So that's highly influenced by the noise. If you don't give the explosion any noise, it's gonna be just a ball without any detail. So I'm gonna set the noise to 10 for now. And for the settings of the main grid, let's set Z as gemmed minus as usual to give it a floor. And let's increase the resolution a little bit. So maybe 0.9 meter cell size, around 2 million total cells as usual to start. I'm gonna enable the adaptive grid by temperature. And let's set the threshold to 500 degrees. Under dynamics, we can let's do 0.3 for cooling. So as you can see, the fuel will slowly burn out and cool down. So I think that's a pretty cool effect. So you can influence this by the fuel depletion parameter and also by the cooling parameter. So let's set cooling to 0.3. For the massive vorticity, this is gonna influence the look of the smoke the most. So let's set the smoke to maybe 0.5 and large scale we can leave at 0.5. Let's do direct symmetric conservation and maybe the quality we can do 40, but I would raise this to maybe 80 later on. This will get you nicer swirling of the smoke later on in the simulation because conservation is from the word conserve or, maintain. So it's basically going to maintain the energy and the detail in the smoke. Let's output fuel and let's output velocity. So the main thing I really want to talk about is the fuel tab that we haven't touched on yet. So what you want to do is just say enable burning and then the ignition temperature. Really what you need to know is that the default temperature of the environment is 300 degrees. So if you want the fuel to ignite, you have to make it less than 300. So maybe you can make it 290, which means that if the fuel has an ignition temperature of 290 and the environment has a temperature of 300, the fuel will be ignited by the 300 degree temperature. So if you make this 350, the fuel will not ignite. So that's something that you need to understand. The energy parameter controls how much temperature the fuel creates as it burns. So if you make the energy, let's say 20 instead of 10, you're gonna release a ton more temperature. So for now, let's set this to 5. Fuel depletion is how fast the fuel burns out. So maybe let's give it something like 0.8 because I kind of like how slowly the fuel is burning out over time. The smoke amount is how much smoke is generated by the burning fuel. The smoke threshold, all you really need to know is that higher values will produce less smoke. So I'm gonna set this to 1. And the propagation is very similar to expansion in Fume Effects if you've ever used that, but basically this will control the speed of expansion of the burning fuel. So if you're getting something like a big bubble, instead of a nice explosion, the propagation is probably too high. So I'm gonna set this to 2. And let's run the simulation, and then we're gonna play with these settings so you can see how they work. Alright, so I'm running the simulation, and we have a nice little explosion happening. You can see that first the fuel is released, and there's no fire. And then as the fuel comes in contact with the hotter environment, it is ignited, and it turns into this beautiful explosion, and then the fuel burns out. So let's set the ignition temperature to, let's say, 400 and run the simulation and see if it works. And as expected, it's not working because the ignition temperature is higher than the environment, so the fuel is not ignited. So that's just to prove that this works as it should. So this needs to be under 300 if you want the fuel to immediately start burning on its own. However, what I want you to be aware of is even though you can't see anything because the fuel is not being ignited, if you turn off the GPU preview, the fuel is actually still there and it's shaded with this yellow color. So as you can see, you can turn off the preview for the fuel. So the fuel is in the scene. So if, let's say, you have another object in the scene that is hotter than 290, it will ignite the fire. So maybe let's make this 400, and I'm gonna make another object. So maybe let's do another sphere and put it in here, and I'm gonna do another source, and maybe let's just give this source a temperature of 2000, and let's add the sphere. So now if I run the simulation, what should happen is as soon as this fuel comes in contact with this burning sphere, with this hot temperature of 2000, the fuel should get ignited. So let's run the sim and see if we get that. Alright, this is why I love Phoenix, because it just works the way you would expect, and it's super cool. So as you can see, the little sphere is emitting the 2000 degree temperature. And if I turn off the GPU preview again, you can see that the fuel is here. And as the fuel comes in contact with this hot temperature, it is slowly igniting that fuel around that sphere until that fuel is ignited and it burns out. So if I were to set the ignition temperature for the fuel even lower, you would see more of the fuel get ignited even more. So this is super cool to play with as far as any sort of gradual burning. You could maybe just create a lot of fuel in the scene, maybe, and then just have fire here and the fuel would slowly burn like a path. So that's something you could definitely try and play with. Next, I want to show you the energy. So let's set it to 20 instead of 5 so you can see what that does and run the sim. So like I said, energy will basically create more temperature as the fuel burns out. That's why everything is pure white, because a ton more temperature is being emitted, and so the explosion is basically a lot hotter, and that's why the volumetric shader is shading everything as white, because there's just so much temperature in there. So as you can see, that's energy 20. At energy 5, we were getting that nice explosion that we got before. Let me set the fuel depletion to maybe 5 and see how much quicker the fuel will burn out. So I'm gonna run the sim again. So at fuel depletion 5, the fuel actually barely has any time to live. Basically, as soon as it's ignited, it's depleted. So you only get these few little flames in there, but you barely get any fire whatsoever. So that's why I set the fuel depletion to something like 0.8 or lower, and then it'll last longer and give you this long burning effect. Now the smoke amount is pretty self-explanatory. If you raise this number, you're gonna get more smoke generated by the fuel, and it works in conjunction with the smoke threshold. The higher the smoke threshold number, the less smoke will be generated by all the fuel. So I'm gonna leave these alone, and then I wanna still show you the propagation. So I'm gonna set it to the default value of 10 and run the sim. So as you can see, with a propagation of 10 instead of 2, we're getting a much bigger explosion, because again, this controls the expansion of the fuel as it burns. So we're still emitting the same amount of fuel at the 500 outgoing velocity in frame 1, but all of that fuel is expanding a lot more than it was before. So you end up with a much larger explosion. The other way to get a larger explosion would be to maybe set the outgoing velocity to 1000 instead of 500, and you could get a bigger explosion that way too. So I hope that all of these settings make sense. Really, there are only a few and they're pretty easy. So after you get the ignition temperature right, you would just adjust the energy and the propagation and the fuel depletion to get the kind of an explosion look that you're after. So I'm gonna run the explosion one more time at the settings that I prefer, so that we can play with the volumetric shader. Alright, so I'm running the sim and the explosion was very low resolution, so I gave us about 4.5 million total cells, about 0.64 meters cell size, just to get some nicer detail in there. I'm gonna stop the sim, and let's go into the volumetric options and see how we can make this look a bit nicer. So we're basing the shading on temperature like we did earlier in this course, meaning that the hottest temperature is the brightest and the lowest temperature is darker based on this color gradient. So actually I'm gonna go under the smoke color first, and let's make the constant smoke color darker, and that will instantly give us more contrast. And then under smoke opacity, I would probably raise the opacity of the smoke, which will give us this thicker, more large-scale look of the explosion. And then I would go maybe back under the fire and raise the fire multiplier just to brighten that up. And then we can play with this curve like we did before to get some different look of the fire itself. So really it's up to you to sort of play with this and see what kind of effect you're going for, maybe what your reference is. Always try to have just a few of those hot spots, and then give it a bit of contrast by creating a bunch of points and having some of them go up and some of them go down. Will give you more contrast in between the different stages of the explosion. So you can see as I drag this, I'm getting a different look. So really, this is the place to look up any kind of reference or think about your shot and what the explosion should look like for you. I'm gonna say that I'm pretty happy with how this looks, and you can always just add more colors here. So maybe we can make the lower temperatures more red and the higher temperatures maybe more yellowish. And you can drag these colors around to see what kind of effect you're gonna get. And sometimes it's good to make some of them a darker color. You can see that it'll give you a completely different look as well. So you can maybe drag this further in and then maybe introduce some black. Let's see, you see, if I put the red one in here, that's pretty cool. So really there's no law or rules for this. It's really just a fun way to play around with these colors and see how you can get something that you really like, that you think is cool. So maybe I'm gonna give it a bit of yellow in here, just see what that looks like, just for fun. Okay, it doesn't look good. But I'm gonna say that I'm happy with this sort of darker red fiery look for the explosion. This is what it looks like right now. So it's still very low resolution, but what I would do for my final sim is go under grid and maybe give us 0.4 meters for the cell size. I would maybe go under dynamics and increase the quality to 100, and you could do 2 steps per frame. And I feel like there's still a lot of empty space in the grid, so I'm gonna make it a bit tighter. So I'm gonna just reduce the X and reduce the Y and just let the adaptive grid do what it needs to do. And you can lower the Z as well. So let me run a few frames and see what it looks like in high res. Alright, so this is our explosion as of right now. I am gonna say that I am happy with how this looks, and in the next lesson we're gonna talk about rendering.